Hey everyone, this is Daisha Jones and Dr. Aaron from the Great Lakes
Hi,
Research
everyone.
and Education Center, and we are so excited to be part of the Great Lakes Odyssey.
Odyssey.
So you're getting ready to watch one of our episodes from one of the Great Lakes. So we want you to dive in, listen to what's happening there, and really decide, do you want to make a difference? We hope you enjoy it.
And thanks for your help.
Well, welcome everyone. My name is Daisha Jones with Expeditions in Education, and welcome to the Great Lakes Odyssey. Now today we are representing Keweenaw National Historical Park, and we're here with a brand new ranger for you. But before we start, let's talk a little bit about this Odyssey and who has sponsored this Odyssey. So we're very, very grateful to be here on Lake Superior at Keweenaw National Historical Park. We're also going to tell you in a few minutes actually where we're standing, but we want to thank Save the Dunes, which is a friends group from Indiana Dunes National Park. We also want to thank the Great Lakes Research and Education Center, where we found Dr. Aaron. A shout out to our nonprofit Expeditions in Education. And we also want to tell you that all of this was fully funded by the National Park Foundation, and we're very, very grateful for that. As you may have been following along with us before, we have brought some fictional characters to life with us for the Great Lakes Odyssey. So we have Oliver, Link, and Tony, and then we actually have Layla and Charlotte has been actually traveling with us, the real Charlotte, and you'll get to meet her in just a little bit. As you might remember, they are trying to solve problems or challenges that each of these Great Lakes National Parks come up against. So on this next slide, do you notice that we have some silhouettes of people that are unnamed? We hope that those will be you. We hope that when we're finished with this Great Lakes Odyssey, that you will raise your hand and say, I'm in. I want to help the Great Lakes. I want to make sure that we're taking care of the Great Lakes. So let's take a quick look at what the characters are up to. So Dr. Aaron, take it away.
Thanks so much. So Link, who's usually the science whiz, suggested, Tony, why don't you take the lead on the scientific aspects this time? We're going to be looking at copper mining and stamp sands. You've got a solid grasp of engineering and can mentor us on the technical details. Tony agreed. Absolutely, Link. And maybe you can focus on the historical context and teach us about the significance of copper mining and its cultural heritage. Leela, eager to contribute, said, I'll handle the data analysis and preservation aspects. Charlotte, could you help me with the environmental impact studies? Charlotte smiled. Of course. And Oliver, you can guide us all through this process, ensuring we're working cohesively and staying on track.
I love that. And if you've been following the story, this time the characters are changing up their roles a little bit. So Charlotte was very comfortable with the biologist side of this, right? But now she's going to sort of slip over into another role. And I think that's important for us to think about, that in this world of park service, that we all sort of cross over into other places. Dr. Aaron, before we introduce our guest today, this is day 12. Day 12 on the road. What has stood out to you so far during this Great Lakes Odyssey?
Oh, there's so much. Each lake has been very different. I think kind of to the point that we were just talking about is that how nicely everyone works together. So we've been really pulling together our resource managers and our interpreters and our volunteers at every place we've gone. And everyone has been so eager to jump in, and the different perspectives are really adding a lot to helping us learn about each place.
And I know that you're excited to be here at this place because we're talking about some geology again, and all things science make you happy.
It's true.
The geology really gets you excited. So we're excited for you to share all that you know.
Okay.
Let's talk to Dr. Carl. We're going to turn you into a doctor today because you're extremely smart. But Ranger Carl, thank you so much for joining us. Now, give the kids just a quick background on where you're from and what you do here at Keweenaw National Historical Park.
Okay, well, thank you for having me. My name is Ranger Carl, and I grew up in the Western Upper Peninsula. So the Western UP has been my home. I grew up in a small town called Paulding, and I went to school for fish biology. I work at a national historical park, and I talk about geology.
I love the different web of that you have, and it kind of goes back to sometimes we know a little bit about a lot, right? Now you have been here for how many seasons?
Well, this will be my 11th season with Keweenaw National Historical Park.
Well, great. Well, we are actually standing at the Amique
All meek, yeah.
Stamp Mill in Tamarack City. So if you will look behind me, and if I can get my hand to move, I'm going to show you this stamp mill behind us. And this is what we're going to be talking about today. And we're going to be talking about the output or waste that comes from mining copper, something called stamp sands. But before we do, Ranger Carl, will you tell us a little bit about this place, the historical significance of Keweenaw?
Yes, so Keweenaw National Historical Park is here to, it's pretty much everything copper, right? But the copper mines in the copper country of Michigan were at critical points during United States history. So they were the largest producers of copper for the U.S. Up until 1887, I think it was. So during the 1860s, what was going on? The Civil War.
Civil War, yeah.
So copper here was being used to make cannon for the Union Army during the Civil War. And then if we zoom ahead a little bit in the 1880s, we start to see electrification. So we're getting this new lighting. So the copper here was integral into developing that infrastructure so that we could have the electrification of the nation.
I love that during historical points in times, the areas, the Park Service before they became the Park Service, were involved in what was happening in our country. In fact, Mammoth Cave National Park, during that era of the Civil War, were busy inside the caves using saltpeter to create things that were needed for the war, gunpowder there. There's so much geology here, like crazy amounts of geology. In my world, I have an igneous rock, a sedimentary rock, and a metamorphic rock. But there's so much more to that. Who wants to start talking about the geology of this place?
Well, I think I'll just set it up to say kind of what we saw on our way up here. So we have already been together to Lake Erie, which was all a very soft sedimentary rock. If you guys remember, it was limestone. And then we were able to travel over to Indiana Dunes where we saw not the rock, but the pulverized rock in the form of sand. And then we moved on to pictured rocks, which had these beautiful, striking vertical rock structures, which were made out of sandstone, another sedimentary rock that's pretty friable and was being sculpted and molded by the wind and the waves and the ice. But when you get to Keweenaw, it is completely different. The ground is black and a reddish color. You're seeing pieces of rock, like whole boulders that have just broken off and are all along the landscape. And the buildings, of course, are built from the rock that you can see at the surface. So I think we've moved into igneous territory.
I love it. So what made this such a good place for copper mining?
Well, largely because of the geology. So the geology in the Keweenaw Peninsula is unique. And it's actually home to the largest supply of native metallic copper in the world. And so when I talk about native metallic copper, I'm meaning that it's metal already usable straight from the ground. So the most mines in the world are mining copper sulfide or copper carbonate or copper oxide. And that's copper that's mixed with some other elements, and it's unusable as a metal. You need to smelt that in order, so basically you're driving off those other elements to get the usable metal. But here we had shiny metal underground. And that really was unique, like I said, it's unique, and the early geologists and explorers of the area didn't really have a good grasp as to what this area could, the potential of the area, because they are used to copper sulfide or other ores.
So, go ahead.
I was just going to say, if I'm hearing you correctly, then we have the very valuable form of copper. It is at the surface and, well, near the surface and relatively easy to get to and ready to use. So those are some really important things because it makes for successful mining.
Yeah.
And you talked about smelting, which has the word melt in there. Is there any connection?
Well, so we have smelters here. In fact, one of the best preserved examples of a 19th century copper smelter in the world. But because it was already made of metal, there wasn't smelting going on. It was mostly melting.
Okay.
So we didn't need to drive off those other elements because there's already, Cu, the element copper.
Well, I've been excited about this park since we discussed it because I wanted to eat something at a park that wasn't at a restaurant.
Okay.
So I'm going to put on a quick video and I want you to tell me what is happening. So teachers, if you are following along with us on our list of resources, we had some recipes for rock candy.
Yeah, and we should mention igneous rock, right? What does igneous rock mean again? It's a rock that forms from crystallization of magma, and I think your activity is going to show us that right now.
I love it. All right, so let's put it up here and it's going to be a very quick video, and teachers, you're going to notice that there are some instructions there if you want to do this in the classroom, but let's talk through this.
So making rock candy. The reason we're making rock candy is because the copper forms in a very similar process to how you make rock candy. I'm showing you the stick there. That's the stick that's going to grow the crystals on. All right. So now we're wetting the stick to hold the sugar, drying it, and adding a little bit of water. And it's actually quite amazing to see how much sugar dissolves in that a little bit amount of water. And
so those are the elements being dissolved in the water?
So yeah, the sugar is being basically ripped apart and held into solution in the water. And that's what was going on underground. The water was moving around, stripping elements as it goes. So here I'm inserting the stick, and now you wait. And it takes some time. So after 2 weeks, you'll see that much crystal growth. And then after 4 weeks, you have that larger piece.
And I'm really excited because through the magic of science, we have our rock candy right here. So I'm just going to do a little bit. Now, when I first tried rock candy, I immediately tried to crack it with my teeth, which is not the way you do it. You suck on it a little bit, and that sugar, that pure sugar, just starts to melt.
Yep, dissolve.
I'm almost thinking I'll just stand here and eat this, but I gotta keep going from this. But rock candy would be a great way. Another way to represent rocks is you can use crayons. You can do some melting of crayons. You can do things with all kinds of candy. There's activities out there on how you demonstrate the rock cycle. Before we get into more rocks, and while I give myself a chance to do this while you talk, tell us a little bit about the cultural heritage of this place and why it was important and how it led to make this place what it is today.
Yeah. So the copper mines started to develop in the mid-1800s, and after the first successful mine in Keweenaw County, it's called Cliff Mine, that proved that it could be done in terms of economical, mining. So then what you needed was people to be miners. And during that period of time, we had immigrants from all around the world come here, from mostly Europe, to get a job, and everyone had their own reasons. So my great-grandfather came from Finland to work in Mohawk, which is in Keweenaw County. And he worked in the rock house. All right. So we have lots of immigrants from Finland still here today, or descendants from the immigrants. So myself, I'm a third generation American. Okay. That's not very long ago when my great grandfather came here in the 1890s. So actually the Keweenaw, or the Upper Peninsula, has the largest population of Finns outside of Finland. But we have other heritage groups as well, like, it's a big list. Italians, French, English. So they specifically were calling out for Cornish miners, because in Cornwall, which is part of the UK, they were mining tin and copper already. So they were experienced, right? So they specifically called out for them to do that. But not every job was underground. As the mines developed, they got deeper and deeper. They needed more surface workers. That's what my great-grandfather did. He was in the rock house, which is above ground. But another place they needed workers above ground is at the stamp mills. And that's what we're at a site of right now.
I love that. I did read somewhere that they were hiring people, paying them money for their backs, which meant manual labor. Like
Yes.
this was hard work, like the things that they did. Now, I want to sort of imagine this place years and years and years and years ago in geology time. So I hear that you guys have a rift volcano demonstration. So can you guys bring that over?
This is special.
And kids, we are also going to bring up Charlotte at this time. As you might recognize, Charlotte is part of our great heroes of the our heroes of the Great Lakes Odyssey, and she is going to be our helper for this particular rift volcano. So huge shout out to Ranger Carl, who built this display. And Carl, just for a moment, can you just tell us the materials you use for this in case any of my ambitious teachers want to build one of these?
Yeah. So I always say when working at the park here, I come from a long line of float builders. So I was never in, like, I could never go to a parade because I was in them.
Oh,
All right.
nice.
So this is paper mache, and this is, one technique you can make a float with. So we have some of our old newspapers, and they're strips I cut, and then they're kind of dipped in a glue water mixture to make it thinner. And I lay that over the top of some chicken wire and a little bit of wood to hold the shape. And then paint, and then clear coat.
Well, we have Charlotte here, one of our heroes. So
Should we
why
talk
don't you?
quickly about what a rift is, though? I'm used to the volcanoes that I made in third, fourth grade that were a stratovolcano, one central cone. This looks really different, and maybe that's key to what was happening in the Keweenaw.
Exactly. So, yeah, the volcanoes you see a lot are the stratovolcanoes. That's probably what you think about when you hear volcano, right? Like Mount St. Helens or Mount Vesuvius. They're explosive, right? But most of the volcanoes we had here were this type, which were more oozing. So the lava is coming off the side and creating these big, thick layers of lava, which became basalt. We have one of the Earth's largest lava flows in the Keweenaw Peninsula.
You want to show a rock of basalt right there?
Yeah, so this is basalt right here. This is what the lava became when it solidified.
So you can see that would be very different driving up here than what we saw at other places.
A really dark rock.
Thanks. So the Earth is literally trying to rip itself apart here.
It's separating itself. The continent was ripping apart. So today you can see this process still happening. So this process that happened 1.1 billion years ago to form what we see here in the Keweenaw is happening today. Iceland is a great example, or the Rift Valley in Africa.
Yes. Let's see
That's another great place to see this. So normally when a rift is successful, it creates an ocean. But as you can see, we're not treading water telling the story.
Right.
Something caused the rift to fail. Rift volcanoes that were active for a few million years eventually laid out hundreds of lava layers. And those layers became host to all that copper that was crystallized, kind of like the rock candy we just made.
Okay.
Well, let's make it
Well,
go.
I'm excited. Let's do something.
Should we try
with
it? I haven't tried it yet. So
Charlotte, you
What
ready?
do you think?
I'm excited.
you think it's
I
going to
know
work?
You are.
Okay. So let's see if we can get oozing.
Now, teachers, students, you're going to recognize this. This is just going to be your normal baking soda
Look at
and vinegar, but with a cone or a cinder volcano. Instead of shooting up, it is just sort of spreading out. Is that a characteristic of this?
It is, and again, going back to this really dark black, that tells us that it had different types of minerals, okay? So the darker iron-rich minerals will be more fluid at a higher temperature. So this would have been a high temperature, iron-rich, copper-rich that flows out, as opposed to some of those that are more sticky minerals and that explode. So it's a great exercise. Look at Bowen's reaction series.
Yeah, so I think what I want to share with teachers is one of the activities you can do with this is once it does its first eruption, you can take Play-Doh and put it over where it has spread out, okay? Make a one color of Play-Doh and then erupt it again. And then put another layer of Play-Doh, a different color, and do it a couple of times. And then using a straw, you can take core samples, which is one of the tools or things that volcanologists would use to measure and see the birthdays of these volcanoes.
Exactly, and you're so right. In Hawaii, they map all the lava flows, and you can see they have different ages, which one's on top of another one. And so what a wonderful idea to use the Play-Doh to map out those different lava flows.
I love it. Thank you so much, Charlotte, for doing that for us. And I'm going to put you back on our time stamp over there to make sure we stay on time. I'm going to ask you two to go ahead and move that back over for me. And I want kids, we're going to do a little activity right now. So I want you, with your parent or your teacher's permission, to go ahead and quietly stand up and get some of the loosies out, get the moves and the giggles out. And we are going to dance through the process of having copper. So I'm going to call out the words, and you're going to tell us the motion, and we're going to do a little dance here. So drill, and that's when they were actually drilling into the earth.
You're drilling into the lava layers.
All right, so take your drill and just, and then we're going to go to blast, which is where they would use dynamite.
At one point, yes, dynamite.
Dynamite. So we've drilled and now we're blasting up. And then our next word is muck.
Muck. So that might be a little bit a new word.
Okay.
Muck means picking up the rocks and putting them in a cart.
I love that. If you have horses, you may be asked to muck out the barn.
I do that
which
a
is
lot.
to pick up the belongings of the horse after they don't need them anymore and move those away. So we've drilled, we've blasted, we've mucked, and now another maybe unfamiliar word is we're going to tram or trammel. Tell us what that means.
Tram. Yep. So tramming is pushing the cart. So they had rails in underground. So the cart was on a rail and they would push it. So this is using your back.
That was what they were getting paid for, to use their back. Now we've pushed, now we're going to hoist. And I guess that's picking back up again.
So that's coming out of the ground along the rail that goes up to the surface.
So let's hoist that up there. And then our next one is crush. I'm excited about this. So let's just crush all that we can, and then separate. Now tell us about what that is.
Separate. So what you need to do is you have the crushed rock, which also contains your copper, and you need to separate the copper from the rock. And that's what this process did here, this place.
Perfect. So before we talk about that process, let's do this one more time. And thank you for putting the words up there for me. So everyone's ready? We are drilling, blasting, mucking, tramming, hoisting, crushing, and then separating it. And that, my friends, is where we're finding one of our challenges today, which is stamp sand. Let's start with you. What is that?
So we have arrived at the issue of stamp sands, right? So whenever you have to crush a material and harvest the copper, you're also going to have waste. So stamp sands are going to be the sand-sized version. Remember, sand is just a particle size. So it's going to be the small particles that were produced by the stamping process, or essentially the crushing process. So here you can see I have 2 samples. See if I can get the light right here. But remember, sand is a size.
So that's here.
Yeah, both of these will be sands, right?
Oh,
but
but
they're
these are
here. I'll
small.
flip them
Okay.
over too. This is Lake Superior beach sand. And then we have the stamp sand. So whenever you look at a geologic material, you want to look at a particle size, but then you also want to look at its mineralogy and what it's made out of. So here you can see it's clearly different. It's dark colors. It has different set of minerals. And so this is actually that igneous rock that has now been stamped and left behind what does not have the crusher, the copper. Although it may have a little bit of copper in it, it's not enough to be economically viable or worth the effort for them. So then this becomes a waste that then needs to be discarded.
So if we go back to our dance for a moment, after we have crushed and separated, now this stamp sand is now moved someplace, and that's where it's causing a problem. We do have a question really quick though. So Miss Zimmerman or Miss Schwannekat, what is our question?
So actually, we can file this in the category of great minds because both Angelina and Autumn want to know how big are these volcanoes that you were talking about in that area?
Okay, let's go back to that for just a moment. I'm going to say I have no idea. And I'm going to look at both of my scientists for a moment and see if they know, and if they don't, it's okay. But do we know how big?
So I could take this. At least
Perfect.
I'll try. So in terms of size, we can say that they're very long, because we can look at today is called a mid-continent rift, and that can be traced, farther south in Kansas. That's where it starts, and it's big arc of volcanoes that goes right through the center of Lake Superior and then back down to Detroit and possibly even farther south than that. So there will be volcanoes all along that rift axis, right? And in terms of how much area it covered, I don't know that what size that would be, but the scar was large.
Yeah, I agree. This is like landscape scale, right? And so there are things that we call volcanoes, which we often think of as the ones we can kind of contain and see, the more conical shaped ones like our stratovolcanoes or our cinder cones. And then there's just volcanic activity too. So just imagine that the ground is kind of ripping apart in front of you, because again, this goes back to plate tectonics. Our continent was trying to rip itself apart. Yeah, I sometimes like to do this with a little bit of frosting and graham crackers. You've got the continent was one piece, but then it was trying to rip itself apart, this divergent activity. And so this would have stretched all across the continent with lava flows that, again, are still present on the surface today, which is pretty remarkable.
Yeah, on the surface here. But those other places like Kansas I was talking about,
Right.
they're very deep underground.
Right. Well, that was a great question, and it's a little different than the normal volcanoes that we talk about in school, so I like that. So the volcanoes were here. They created opportunity for copper in some ways. We mined the copper. We took the copper, we crushed it. It becomes what we call stamp sand, and it moves out into areas that it doesn't need to be.
Yeah.
So let's talk about this place called Buffalo Reef.
Okay. Well, stamp sands again are considered basically a waste material, and any mining is going to have waste materials, which then creates an opportunity for more sustainable practices as far as what do you do with the waste. But here in the UP and in a lot of early mining, we just basically discarded and piled up all that waste rock. And then we thought, well, maybe down the road we'll need it again, or we would later come back if we were a little desperate and reprocess it with a lot of chemicals. And that did happen up here too, to try to rip some more of that copper out of it. But the physical stamp sands themselves, in some places, and you'll see a video in a minute here, that we actually moved those and then deposited them in big piles, but also deposited them in piles right along the shore of Lake Superior. So then they behave like other sands. They're going to get redistributed by the wind and the waves. But again, they're a new source. They're not being produced by nature, they're being produced by man. So we're producing these piles of sand much faster than the waves can kind of handle them. And of course, it's a mineralogy that maybe we don't want.
So let's take a look at that. So yesterday we went out to a place called Mohawk Stamp Mill.
Yes.
And we took a little hike out to Lake Superior.
Yeah, and here in this video, we are standing kind of along the edge with Lake Superior behind us, and look at all of that stamp sand that is now filled in the distance between what was the shoreline and the stack there. So we basically built out the shoreline with these artificial waste deposits.
So let's talk a little bit, Carl, about a place called Buffalo Reef and how this stamp sand is negatively impacting the ecosystem there.
So that sand gets moved along south along the Keweenaw Peninsula by Lake Superior's currents. So the stamp sand that was initially dumped really close to the stamp mill was mobilized by one of the strongest lake currents in the world in Lake Superior. It eventually moves far enough south to start covering up Buffalo Reef. And what Buffalo Reef is a critical habitat for spawning grounds for lake whitefish and lake trout. Okay, and those fish need cobbles, which are, again, talking about grain size. Cobbles are going to be larger than sand. So they need that in order for their young to develop. And the sand is filling that in, creating a
So
sandy
they don't have a
environment.
nursery.
Essentially, yes.
They don't have a nursery there. Yeah. And why are the whitefish and the lake trout so important to this area?
So they're both native species to Lake Superior. In terms of the ecosystem, that's extraordinarily important. But in terms of, how it relates to humans, it is, those are the two, I think just two, there might be more, but of the commercial fish that are harvested by Native Americans in Lake Superior.
So this is an economy thing, but it's also a cultural thing. Like because of the waste from the copper mines, this ecosystem is being upset. And if we think about a food web, something in there is going to fall off a little bit.
Yeah, what surprised me too is we hear this word reef, and most of the time today all we hear about are coral reefs, right, down in the tropics. But a reef, again, is sort of this rocky area, and it can be made out of any type of rock. So up here, again, it's more of the native rock that's in this area, but it's a shallower area that creates a good nearshore habitat for spawning. And so it kind of relates back to things we saw back at Pictured Rocks, where you add all this sand and it embeds it, right? We learned that term embeddedness, where the sands will actually fill in kind of the nooks and crannies, and they make a more even substrate. I love that word, substrate, or bottom. And then again, that's not the right habitat or environment anymore for them to lay their eggs, to spawn, and then for the fry to sort of survive. And I loved it. We actually made a trip up to Eagle Harbor, and we saw the historic lighthouse, and there was a whole museum to fishing. And again, some of the videos were actually, do you say in Finnish? What is but they were they were again kind of relating back to the immigrants that had come who had actually done a lot of the fishing up there. The language was Finnish. Cool. Yes, it was very cool to see that. So it was a connection between the people who were working here in the mines and then also a lot of the fishing industry.
I'm thinking about how sometimes we do construction and we move dirt to another pile and it just sits there. Nobody bothers it. It's not bothering anybody else. If they moved this sand to the beaches, doesn't it just sit there?
Not along a coast. So along a coast, and especially one that has the wave intensity and the winds that we see here at Lake Superior, and especially, so the Keweenaw is also a special place because the storms kind of focus here because it's a peninsula that sticks out into Lake Superior. So the waves refract and really pound some of these harbors. And so what will happen then is the waves set up what we call a longshore current, where actually sediment is carried along the shore, and it usually goes in one direction. So as Ranger Carl was saying, we piled up these sands along the coast, but then they are just migrating down the coast onto Buffalo Reef and onto the next harbor as well. So sometimes we think we're going to put something somewhere, and again, this was over 50 years ago, you know, and they're still moving.
They're still moving.
They're still moving.
So what they thought was a good idea then, they were double dipping with the copper, if I'm hearing it correctly. They mined it, but then they went back to find even more out of the same sand.
Sometimes. And sometimes they just said, hey, let's just go with this really rich stuff and then we won't worry about the rest, because it's very expensive to try to pull, and laborious to try to pull the rest of the copper out of it. So they took the cleanest, purest copper and then kind of left the waste rock behind.
We have another question.
We do. We have a couple of questions. The first couple are coming from Miss Tolbert's room at Pierce Elementary. Do the minerals in the earth contribute to the eruption of the volcano, or what specifically would cause that eruption? And then we have one more after that when you finish that one.
So let's do this one. So what actually causes that eruption? As we're talking about all of this, volcanoes are a big deal in schools. They love to talk about them, right? They are pretty awesome. Is it the mineral? Is there anything to do with minerals in the earth that causes it? Or is it more about we know that the plate tectonics, they can move or slide or rip apart. What's actually causing that baking soda and vinegar simulation to happen?
Charles?
Yeah, so here one of the ideas is that there was a hot spot under Lake Superior at the time. And so that hot spot, so, you start getting that separation happening. It's thinning. You get a thinning of the crust, and then the divergence. So thinning and then divergence. And that hot spot is adding that energy to fuel that.
Yeah, sometimes I like to think about it if you've ever made banana bread. Right? So you make the banana bread, and as it bakes, it actually kind of will come apart in the center because the heat is internal. And so it is kind of pushing that pressure, and then you get almost like a rift in the top of your banana bread when you cook it properly. So again, it's this internal pressure. So make sure you all learn your layers of the earth and how that lithosphere or those plates on the outer they move in response to either pressure from below kind of pushing them up and driving them apart, and then cooling of a plate somewhere else that pulls it back into that asthenosphere.
So 2 years ago, we were at Hawaii Volcanoes for a live stream, and they talked about a hot spot. And that's a great connection here, that there was possibly a hot spot here causing this rift volcano, but we also have those at Kilauea at Hawaii Volcanoes.
Yes, and like you said too, so the lighter minerals tend to be a little stickier, things like our quartzes and feldspars, and our dark minerals, things that are rich in magnesium and iron, tend to be more fluid. And so that's why you see them both at Hawaii, that dark lava, and then you see them here as well, and they flow out as lava flows.
Nice. Great question. What's another question?
Jaden would like to know, talking about the stamp sand, is it safe to walk on without shoes?
Ooh, great question. In fact, that was one of my first questions when we came here, because in my mind it was going to be very large. So Dr. Aaron had to explain to me that it's still sand, but just of a slightly larger quantity. So is it safe?
So it is not comfortable to walk on, we'll say that. So again, a big difference why we know that this is not natural sand is that it's angular. And so again, a sand-sized particle that is bounced around by the wind will be rounded, it will be smoothed, and so we all like to play with that kind of sand. But we can tell this was a mechanical crushing because they have not bounced around. They have not been rounded by wind or by waves, and so they are very angular, and so I would not walk on them myself with my bare feet as well. And so the other thing too, I mean, Ranger Carl expressed that we should notice where we are, that this behind us is the actual physical crusher. And did you say it's the only one left here at the park?
As far as I know, it's, yeah.
Yeah.
Talk about the hammer for just a moment. So we're going to try to zoom in just a little bit on this stamp mill, and let's just talk about that real quick before we give our challenge to our students.
Yeah, so this is right along the highway here, and it's basically a huge hammer.
Oh.
Right? But this is not just a hammer that's dropped. This is a hammer that's forced down. It's a steam-powered stamp mill. So the steam power forces that hammer down and crushes the rock with extreme pressure. And that's how they got the rock crushed.
Yeah, so I guess I will say to Jaden, it's safe if you don't mind your feet maybe being cut up a little bit, but it's not fun.
It's not fun. No, it's sharp.
Also, it's dark.
It's dark.
So it gets very hot.
Oh,
from
great
the sun.
point.
That makes sense
It's
too.
very, very hot.
Wear your water shoes. All right, so we're coming to this part of our Great Lakes Odyssey when we then turn the tables back to you and see how you can help us as we think about what to do with the stamp sands. So I'm going to actually hold up a display, and I'm going to let Dr. Aaron and Ranger Carl talk a little bit about what we see here and what are some of the things that you're considering here at Keweenaw National Historical Park, because this is within your park. Like, this is something that you have to figure out, right?
So I love this because this is a way of storytelling. So this is something that you all could think about too when you are doing your design challenges. And so what they wanted to show us is that stamp sand is having different effects depending on where it is. And Ranger Carl can help me with this, but we have 3 locations. We have Sand Point, which is, again, one location, and then we have Buffalo Reef, which is the spot that we showed you right along the shore of Lake Michigan, and then we have Torch Lake. And so the stories are a little bit different there, and you have to understand your environmental setting and what the impacts are of the stamp sands. So here below each one of these, so look at them as each location, they are considering the pros and cons of different approaches, which actually links back as well to what you'll see in the graphic novel with our heroes, is they start by making this pro and con list. So let's look back here. Carl, do you want to point out a couple? Let's visit Sand Point and just see what they tell us.
So other key points is this, like you're saying about locations. Both Sandpoint and Buffalo Reef are within Lake Superior, and Torch Lake is an inland lake. It's separate, so it's much smaller than Lake Superior. So there's some points there. But Sandpoint, what do we got? Sandpoint is on culturally significant land to the Keweenaw Bay Indian community. Here, the birds, fish, and plants that normally live in these wetlands have had severe population decline and are unsafe for consumption. How will you mitigate this?
Oh, I love that, because we're actually considering everybody's contributions, right? It said that it's important to the Native American community too, and they may have their own input, and it's important to kind of take an inventory of how this is affecting everyone.
So let's look at the next one. What is this?
Oh, that's Buffalo Reef.
Buffalo Reef.
And the stamp sands covered up important spawning ground for the whitefish and lake trout and decreased the biodiversity significantly. The sand's toxins reduce fish survival rates because they are leaching that into the water, and the impact on the Lake Superior fishing industry is huge. What will you do to fix this? And again, you might want to see who are my community partners and listen to their voices and their input as well.
Another thing that we didn't really mention, sorry, is the sand's toxins.
Yes.
Oh, tell me that again.
So the stamp sand contains copper because they can't get it all out. You mentioned that earlier. And the copper itself is toxic to fish and all the organisms that live near the bottom of the lake, and benthic organisms. But also the stamp sands that came from those mills that's affecting Buffalo Reef contain arsenic.
Oh, I know arsenic is bad.
Arsenic is bad also for
And
organisms.
that can happen, that can get into humans then, because we eat the fish, right? So we want to be thinking about that.
Oh yeah, back to our food web and biomagnification, right? So small fish may consume some of that, but then a big fish needs to eat many of the small fish, and so that can get more concentrated as it goes up the food chain.
All right, let's look at one more. And this last one is
Torch Lake.
Torch Lake. So let's talk about Torch Lake.
Stamp sands here were redredged, so this is our inland lake, and stamped twice because they wanted to get more out of it. This means they are leaching more toxic elements into the water than the typical stamp sands. This has caused tumors and highly toxic fish, which are unsafe to eat, and has disrupted the lake's biodiversity. How will you fix that? And below that, there are some options: dredge the sands and move them to a dump, or cover them up with sand and just cap them in place. And you need to explore the pros and cons of each.
So let's get our pencils out right now, and in your journals, I just want you to name these 3 locations. So Ranger Carl, can you name these 3 locations one more time?
So we have Sand Point,
Sand Point,
Buffalo Reef,
Buffalo Reef, and that's where those fish are that we want to help,
and Torch Lake.
and Torch Lake. And I think that they may be coming up on the screen in just a moment, but those are the 3 places we want you to do some research on, because we need to figure out ways to fix it. So there's a couple things. You could leave it alone, just live with it. You could do something about it, or you could redirect. Now they are doing something here, so can we talk about what they're doing to stamp sands?
Can Charlotte help me hold this up for a
Charlotte,
sec?
come on up around us up here. Come all the way around me. And this is not a terrarium, although it does have the look of one. Let's talk about this. What's happening here?
I think this is a model, so I love this. Again, we ask you kind of to develop a model, and this is a physical model of what happens if we chose to leave them in place and then try to cap them. So down here, we actually have the stamp sands, real stamp sands, and then we have a thin layer of soil, and of course it's hard to know how thick you need to make that, and then they're actually using plants here at the top as a form of bioremediation. So these plants, the idea is that they will then hold the cover soil in place to cap them in place, and then hopefully maybe actually even as they grow take some of the toxins out of the sands, and then we could kind of harvest them and then regrow and help remediate some of that.
I love that. So that is something that is happening. We just have a little bit of time left, and I want to get to a few questions, but I want to ask you, what does the future look like for the Keweenaw Peninsula?
I would say the future is bright if we can solve these problems that we're talking about here. And you know, what we're doing is we're educating. We're trying to get people aware of a problem. And if you're aware of a problem, then you can care. Right?
I love
I
that.
love that. Be aware so you can care about it. Did you make that up?
Yeah.
Okay, that's why we're giving him his doctorate, because that was pretty profound. A doctorate in philosophy. That was
Love it.
good. So you're doing that now through talks, through displays. In fact,
Things
one
like
of the
this.
displays we just showed was created by one of your interns, a Yes intern. Her name was AJ, and she actually created this display to present it to other people. So I love that you said the future is bright, but you're just a few people here, right?
Yeah.
So having others to help. So here's your challenge. Boys and girls, I want you to do as much research as you can on the Keweenaw Peninsula. I want you to tell your teachers to let you go to our website where you're going to find a bunch of resources listed on a book. I want you to pull those resources, talk about the 3 different places, Sand Point, Torch Lake, and Buffalo Reef, and decide what would you do to take care of the stamp sands, whether it's leave it there, reuse it for something else. In fact, we've already had a student from another state, I think it was New Mexico, that thought, well, maybe we can use that stamp sand in architecture or construction. Maybe get it out and use it to build houses with. Leanne, Miss Zimmerman, Miss Swanekamp, do we have any more questions in the chat?
We do. So great question. With the recent damage from Hurricane Helene in the mountains of North Carolina, could a huge storm like that impact the soil cap method?
Ooh.
Wow, and I love that because we know that right now we are feeling the horrid part of a hurricane, especially in Georgia, Florida, South Carolina, North Carolina, Western North Carolina, Tennessee. So the question is, would a storm like that affect the soil cap?
It could.
Okay.
I mean, there's always a possibility that it could. So add that to your engineering design challenge. You know, maybe you're going to put something along the outer edge, you know, some sort of barrier along the outside like they do with seawalls, you know. So think about all those possibilities and think about those pros and cons as you do your design.
Yeah. We have another question.
We do. Is there a collection process for stamp sand after the crushing and separating?
Is there, okay, so once we have drilled and trammeled and hoisted and all those things, and then we separate, what is the collection then? What happens with that final separation? Where do things go?
So the copper is collected, and then it is sent to the smelter to be melted down. And the stamp sand from there gets dumped into piles in the lake.
Okay, so that's how
Yeah.
the separation happens.
I think we should be really clear that they're no longer mining the copper here, right? Oh, that's why everything is looking a little like ruins. So the companies that did all that and would have also taken care of it are long gone. So we are just dealing with the residual waste as a community and listening to community voices about what we can do with what's left behind.
And remember, the copper mining was not bad.
Nope.
It's what it was needed at the time. It provided a boost to the economy. It was used to sell, to use, but that's years and years and years ago. So as we are doing new things now with technology, we need to think about what will our great grandkids have to deal with? What waste are we given or leaving for future generations? All right. Ms. Zimmerman, I think we have a prize package to announce today. Can you tell us who our winners are of a classroom set of stickers and buttons from the Great Lakes Odyssey?
I can. Well, let's go back one day from our last one. Our last winners were Carla Bellinger, Sabrina Valen, and April Cox. So I want to give them a shout out. Today's winners are, drum roll please, Miss Tolbert's class in North Carolina, Miss Sullivan's class, I believe she's with Uplift Michigan, and then we also have Miss Lundberg with Uplift Michigan.
Very good. So Miss Zimmerman, if you wouldn't mind getting some school addresses for us, and we will get that stuff packed up and send it from Michigan. So you should get that pretty soon. I want to thank everyone for joining us today. This is number 4 in the series of Great Lakes Odyssey. You can remember that you can make a difference, but you can reach out to us at Dacia at expeditionsandeducation.org, which Ms. Schwanekamp and Ms. Zimmerman are now putting that into the chat window. We will send you a follow-up email today to sort of cap or recap all that we've talked about and give you a little bit more resources. Next week,
where are we going next?
We are going to Sleeping Bear Dunes. So let's just recap real quickly. We have been to Perry's Victory
Yep.
on Lake Erie. We've been to Indiana Dunes National Park on Lake Michigan. We have been to Pictured Rocks on Lake Superior. We are at Keweenaw on Lake Superior. And now we're going back to Sleeping Bear Dunes, back to Lake Michigan again. So we hope that you will join us next Wednesday. We also want to thank our sponsors, Save the Dunes, the Great Lakes Research and Education Center. Shout out to our amazing people from Expeditions and Education who are behind the scenes and behind the screens helping us out. And all of this was made possible by the National Park Foundation. So can we give a bunch of high snaps to the National Park Foundation for making all of this possible? So on behalf of Dr. Aaron, Great Lakes Hero Charlotte, Ranger Carl, and myself, Dacia Jones, thank you for joining us for the Great Lakes Odyssey, and we are out of here, everyone. Have a great day.
Thanks for watching.
We hope you can visit the website expeditionsandeducation.org/Great Lakes Odyssey. Help us change the world.